Gabor,
Hi.
how
Hi.
are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm well,
Good.
right? I'm in this aging thing and watching physically things go on, and
Uh,
I'm well, right?
are you saying we're getting older? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I know I am. I got a big 7-0 birthday coming up.
Well, you listen. You're still green behind the ears. I'll have my 8-0 in January.
Whoa,
Yeah,
whoa.
yeah.
Well, we look good. That's all I got to say. We look good.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
And still doing the deal, doing the work. Yeah,
That's right.
I
That's
love
right.
it. I love it. So again, thank you for doing this. I know you're doing vacation and the whole 9 yards, so I'm so grateful. I'm
No,
just so grateful.
I'm glad. I'm
Yeah,
glad to speak with you.
yeah. So just as a little orientation again, this is the yoga and recovery, healing, addiction, and eating disorders symposium. And
Okay.
this is the second year. And after the first year was great. Part of the first year was we had people from all these different aspects, people that were doing policy, people from healthcare, people from community organizing, and all of that kind of stuff. The idea of it was to begin to dismantle silos, right? That all of these people are coming at it from these different directions. Was there a common thread that we could
Yeah.
weave through,
Yeah.
right? And that kind of thing. And it was great. It was really, really good. And we were left with the need to go deeper, right? And so that is what this year is all about.
Okay.
And the theme again is around healing, around creating cultures of
Yeah.
prevention and healing, right?
Good.
That whole
Good.
idea of creating cultures of prevention. So I'm gonna just do a little intro that for you in
Good.
this thing, and then we'll just go into some of the things around the myth and normal, the bridge.
Will be a question answer thing.
No, yeah, I'll ask you some questions and some
Okay.
general
Good. Good.
all of it from the book, right?
Okay.
Just
Great.
general directions to go in,
Great.
and you just go ahead and take off.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, I love it. All right, so our tech person is on the line back there,
Yeah.
and she's recording and doing the whole deal with that. So we should be good to go.
Yeah. Anytime you guys are ready.
All right, so all right. So hello everyone, and welcome to the Yoga and Recovery, Healing Addiction and Eating Disorders opening session. And I am beyond delighted to introduce Dr. Gabor Maté, a renowned physician, author, and speaker whose groundbreaking work sheds light on the intricacies of human health and well-being. His books include Scattered Minds, When the Body Says No, In the Realm of the Hungry Ghost, and his widely acclaimed 2021 documentary, The Wisdom of Trauma, provided this nuanced understanding of trauma, not just as an individual experience, but also as a societal issue, deeply rooted in cultural and systemic factors. It exposes the interplay between childhood trauma, addiction, mental health, and the broader cultural context in which we live. It was viewed over 4 million times in its first 7 days, its 7-day premiere. And throughout his career, Dr. Maté has been a determined advocate for those marginalized by mental health issues, addiction, and trauma. And his unwavering dedication to raising awareness and dismantling stigma surrounding these topics have inspired so many to approach mental health and addiction in a different way, with much more compassion and openness. What I notice most in conversation with Dr. Maté and in all his work is this deep and real and genuine caring, and this very unique ability to bridge the gap between science and human experience. So today we're going to delve into the latest collaborative work of Dr. Maté and his son, Daniel Maté, and the book is The Myth of Normal. And there it is. I love it. I love it. This book was published just last year, and this work challenges the rigidity of social norms and invites us to question the concept of normalcy. And it invites us to embrace the full, diverse range of human emotion and experience that make us who we are. It encourages a fresh perspective on prevailing cultural narratives that prioritize individualism and data-driven outcomes, and emphasizes the importance of compassion, connection, and our interdependence as we all navigate the complexities of addiction and mental health. So as we delve into this conversation, here's an invitation to all who are listening. You're invited to challenge any preconceived notions, expand your perspectives, and reimagine ways of understanding and addressing addiction, eating disorders, and mental health, so that we can help pave the way for more innovative approaches, compassionate support systems, and really build a culture of healing and prevention. Dr. Maté, I'm so grateful for your yes to speak here at the Yoga and Recovery, Healing, Addiction, and Eating Disorder Symposium. And I thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Nikki. It's a pleasure to be with you. My only request is that you go on first name basis. The name is Gabor, and otherwise I can call you Ms. or Dr. Myers, but you know, it's, let's just be friends here.
Which I consider we already are. So we'll do that. I love it. I love it. I love it. So I would love to start, from the beginning of the book, right? In the beginning of the book, one of the things is you encourage readers to question this concept or construct of normalcy. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you'd start by speaking on why you feel that that's important to challenge this notion, and what it means to embrace the full range of human emotion and experience.
Exactly. Well, the word normal does have a useful meaning, which is there's a normal range of body temperature within which we can thrive, outside of which we die. A normal range of blood pressure, normal range of blood acidity. Within that range, what is normal is also healthy and natural. But the mistake that we make is then we transpose that to phenomena that we're accustomed to and used to, and we think they're normal, but they're neither healthy or natural. Mm-hmm. I mean, to put it this way, at a certain area in the United States, it was quite normal for Black people not to be allowed to use drinking fountains meant for white people. It was normal. Everybody did it. Was it healthy or natural? You know, and there's so many things about our culture today that are considered to be the norm, but they're neither healthy or natural. In other words, the subtitle of the book is Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And what I'm saying is that by the various things that this society takes as normal, we're actually toxifying ourselves. So what is normal is no longer healthy or natural. And that comes to from how we raise children, how we give birth to children, actually, how pregnant women are supported or not supported, how kids are educated, how people relate to their work, the pressure that's put on parents economically, socially, And in other ways, these are all considered to be the norm, but they're toxic. So we have to decouple the idea of normality from healthy and natural, and realize that what is normal in this society, or is considered normal, is neither healthy or natural. Now, the other meaning is, if we have this idea of normal, then people who are mentally ill with addiction or psychosis or depression or anxiety or ADHD or whatever, they're considered abnormal, and everybody without these conditions is so-called normal. But what if, in fact, those conditions, whether it's addiction, whether it's mental illness, whether it's even physical illness, what if those are normal responses to abnormal circumstances? So let me give you an example. In the United States, it's been shown that Black women, the more experiences of racism they have to endure, the higher their risk of asthma. Now, in other words, do they have an individual pathology, or is there a social malaise called racism that manifests itself in inflammation in the human body? In which case, who's got the abnormality?
That's right.
Those women or the culture, you know? So, and furthermore, if I'm an example, and I don't know what you say about yourself, is we're all on a continuum, you know? So that to say that some people are normal and others are not is to recognize the contiguity of human experience. So these are all the ways in which normal is a misnomer in our culture.
I love that. I love it. You know, I will often jokingly say that normal is the setting on the washing machine,
Yeah.
right? And I don't even know what it means on the washing machine, right? So,
It's true. I don't either. It's true.
Right. I love it. I love it. So I'm going to come back to that whole idea of, you know, the idea that we're living in a toxic culture, and it affects all of us. It affects all of us, right? And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But what I want to move to is, this really is about addiction in this context that we're talking about. I want to talk about the section of the book where you begin to speak to specifically around that. And in the book, you cite ASAM as well as several other definitions of addiction, right? You talk definitions of addiction. And in that, you talk about blind spots and limitations in the prevailing perspective on addiction, right? And particularly our tendency to view it as an either or, right? Bad choices or disease, or the disease paradigm, right? And I'm wondering if you'll talk about that a little bit, if we can talk about, have that conversation.
Sure. It's an essential conversation. The predominant social view of addiction, the one that actually activates infuses the legal system, is that addiction is a choice that people make. And so if that's the case, if it's a conscious, deliberate choice that they make, and then naturally, if they make bad decisions, then let's punish them for it. That's the essence of the legal approach to addiction. As a result, there's millions of people in jail because of this belief that addiction is a choice. And that whole campaign that Nancy Reagan had about, you know, just say no, implies that people are making a choice and they could make better choices. And if they're not, it's their fault. Now, I can tell you that I worked for 12 years in North America's most concentrated area of drug use, which is the downtown east side of Vancouver, British Columbia, where I live. We have thousands of people in a few square block radius using drugs of all kinds. In the 12 years of work, I never met a single person who ever woke up this morning and said, I'm going to choose to be an addict. It's total nonsense. So let's put the choice idea away. And it's absurd and ludicrous, except for the fact that it's so tragic, the belief in it, in our society. A step forward is the medical view of addiction, which is the disease model. which is also embraced by and large by the 12-step movement. Addiction is the disease of the brain, largely potentiated by genetics, and it makes you do things that are not good for you. It causes all kinds of problems, and it can be and should be treated. But fundamentally, it's a disease that originates in the brain. Now, that's a step forward, because at least you're not going to punish people for having a disease, and you're going to offer them treatment. And at least theoretically, you're going to treat them compassionately, as you would with anybody with any other illness. But is it accurate? No. It's maybe a step forward, but it's not accurate, and in fact, it's inadequate. So allow me to give you a definition of addiction that I don't think is controversial. It's the one that I formulated, but I don't think it's far out. So I'll define addiction. It's a complex process, but it's manifested in any behavior in which a person finds pleasure or temporary relief and therefore craves, but then suffers negative consequences and does not give up or cannot give up despite negative consequences. So pleasure, relief, craving in the short term, harm in the long term, inability to desist. That's what defines an addiction. Now, the first point to notice is that I didn't say anything about drugs. It can certainly include substances, legal ones, such as tobacco and cigarette smoke and alcohol. And it's perfectly legal in my country, Canada, or the United States, to kill yourself with smoking or alcohol, but it's not legal to use heroin. That's a lot of conversation, the absurdity of the so-called war on drugs. But the definition includes substances, licit or illicit, but it can also include gambling, shopping, sex, pornography, the internet, gaming, cell phone, work, self-cutting, bulimia, and a whole lot of other behaviors. Anything that gives you temporary pleasure or relief, then causes harm, you don't give up, that's an addiction. And then when you ask people, I mean, let's just do this experiment right now. So you're kind of standing in for the audience here. So yeah. I'm not going to ask you the details, but according to this definition, Nikki, at one time or another in your life, have you ever had any kind of an addictive pattern?
Yes, and not only that, still do.
Okay, all right. So here's what I'm going to ask you. Thank you for the honesty there, and so have I, by the way. And my question is not what's wrong with the addiction, but what's right about it.
Yeah.
What does it give you that you're looking for? So what hasn't it given you in the short term that you wanted? What was that?
I love this question, right? Because it's easy for me to answer, right? It gave me comfort and ease.
Okay, thank you.
It brought comfort and ease.
Okay. Is comfort and ease in themselves good things or bad things?
They're worthwhile things, right?
They're really worthwhile things.
They're needed things. Yeah.
In other words, the addiction wasn't your primary problem. Your primary problem was discomfort and unease.
Right.
And in other words, these are states of emotional pain, is what it is. And so when you ask anybody, whether it's workaholism, whether it's sex or gambling or shopping, pornography, what does it give them? It gives them a sense of vitality, comfort, ease, as you say, stress relief, numbing of the pain, a sense of control, a sense of community or connection with other people. These are all wonderful things.
That's
and right. So the addiction is not the primary disease. The addiction is a response to emotional pain. Hence my mantra. Don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. Now, if you want to understand why the pain, the source is trauma in every case. So that an infant born into an environment where they're held beautifully, where they're attuned with, where they're accepted, validated, purely loved unconditionally, why would they have unease or distress in their bodies, you know? And so that, and even if they experience stress, how come they don't develop the capacity to deal with it? Mm-hmm. Those are all questions of trauma. So what I'm suggesting is that addiction, in fact, I'll make this more general, what we call mental illness on the whole, and a lot of physical illness as well, these are responses to trauma. So the addiction and the illness, these are not just diseases on their own, they're actually symptoms of a life. And if you want to understand why people have emotional pain, look at their lives. Look what happened to them, you know, both in the family of origin and also in the broader culture. So really tragic example in my own country, but in yours as well, the indigenous population. We know what happened to indigenous people in North America. In Canada now, 50% of the women in jail are indigenous. They make up 6% of the population, of the female population, 50% of the jail population. In the indigenous communities, there's much more likely to be addiction, alcoholism, suicide, self-cutting, children diagnosed with mental health conditions, multi-generational sexual trauma. And these are all the results of colonialism and the colonial policies that have continued to this day. So to say that the addiction is this primary brain disease is utter nonsense. Addiction is a response to life. And to understand and to heal addiction, we have to deal with the underlying trauma that's at the heart of it.
There's so much in what you've just spoken there. You know, I have never really understood why that was always positioned as an either or, right? It's like saying, is it nature or is it nurture, right? And that same argument. And, you know, I've always been, this is an and, it's not an or, it's not an either or, right? Yes, things go on in the brain, and we know that when we're in the throes of addiction and things like that. And we know that things go on in the brain. And truth is, that was very useful for me to find out, right? I know, you know, my lived experience is through drug and alcohol addiction and many, many others as well. And it was useful for me to recognize that there was something that was actually going on in my brain.
Can I interrupt?
I just thought I was making bad choices, right?
Can I interrupt?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. It's even more complex than that, because even what's going on in the brain is conditioned by the environment.
Yeah.
So the brain is a social organ. We know this now. The brain develops in interaction with the environment from in the womb onwards. So that the biology, it's not a question of biology versus nurture, it's that nurture shapes the biology.
I love it.
So let me read you 2 sentences from an article from Harvard University published in the Journal of Pediatrics in 2012. Okay?
Yes.
About brain development. So this is what they say. The first sentence: the architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. In other words, the very physiology of the brain is a process that begins in the womb, continues into adulthood, and it sets the template for everything that happens later. Okay, so what shapes the biology? And which already means that stress on pregnant women will already affect the brain development of the infant, the physiology of the brain. The second sentence goes, the interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. Again, what I'm saying to you is, if you look at the addicted brain with all the stuff that's going on in the endorphin opiate circuitry, the dopamine circuitry, which has to do with motivation, the stress regulation circuitry, the impulse regulation circuitry, all of which are impaired in addicted people. But that impairment is biological, but that biology was shaped by the environment.
Yes.
So it's not a question of biology versus nurture. It's a question that nurture shapes the biology.
Shapes. Yeah. Yes, I love it. I love it. Yeah. And, you know, I was thinking as well, when you were speaking, that whole idea of bad choices,
Yeah,
right? You know, and we know the prison population statistics in the, particularly in the United States, where it's much more heavily African-American men or
yeah,
people of color, right, than
yeah,
it is. And part of this idea that what was a bad choice for them in one period has turned into this profit machine at another time, right? So, you know, I know so many people who have been institutionalized in prison for marijuana offenses.
yeah,
And now this is this big industry,
yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
know, at another point in time that becomes a profit machine. So things change,
Well,
right? And
even if you look at the drug laws, they're very
yes,
racially tinged. For example, take cocaine. You have crack cocaine or you have fine powder cocaine.
yeah,
The chemically and in terms of their effect, they're virtually indistinguishable. But the penalty for people possessing crack cocaine was 7 times as greater than the penalty for white powder cocaine.
yeah,
Now, who could afford the fine powder cocaine? Middle and upper class whites.
right,
Who used the cheap crack cocaine? Underprivileged black youth.
yeah.
So the law was and continues to be strictly
Skewed. Yeah,
racist.
yeah,
When you look at the marijuana laws, they were directed against the Mexican population back in the early 20th century, the Hispanic population, the Mexican American population. So that not only are they irrational in themselves, they're not irrational from a systemic point of view, because of systemic point of view, it allows you to control and constrain uh, minorities,
yeah,
so that behind the ideology of around addiction, there's also a definite political agenda.
yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. The other thing you were speaking to just a moment ago was reframing the question, right?
Yeah,
And I love that idea. And that first thing about what's right about it. What does this give you,
yeah,
right? What is it that it gives you, right? And that is, you know, there's a payoff, right? There's a
yeah,
cost and there's a payoff,
yeah,
right? And like I said, when I ask myself that question every time, it's
yeah,
comfort and ease, right?
yeah,
It gave me this sense of comfort and ease, right? Immediately, right? And so that's a different question than
yeah,
what's wrong with you. That's a different
absolutely,
question than you know, why do you keep making these bad choices? Right. It's a totally different question. Right. I love it.
absolutely, absolutely. And if we start with that question, then we come to, well, first of all, what happened to you in your childhood that robbed you of your inner sense of ease and comfort, and 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 deprived you of the capacity to handle ease and discomfort
Yeah.
in more functional ways?
Yeah.
One. And number two, how can we help you find that ease and comfort within yourself, which is your birthright, so that you don't have to resort to a behavior that has negative consequences?
Yeah.
So that it's not a question of punishing somebody or controlling them or trying to change their behavior. It's actually a question of getting them in touch with their deepest selves, so they can
Mhm.
find because I do believe, Nikki, and I think you agree with me, that every human being, as long as there's consciousness, there's the possibility of healing.
That's right.
And healing literally means wholeness. That's the actual specific meaning of the word healing.
That's
And
it.
the essence of trauma, and trauma simply means a wound. That's what it means. And the essential wound of trauma is disconnection from ourselves, uh, the capacity for ease and comfort and peace rests in your heart. It rests
Yeah.
within you. It rests within your psyche.
Yes.
The fact that you're disconnected from it, or the fact that I can become disconnected from it, that's an artifact of life.
Yeah.
But we can reconnect. And so even when you talk about recovery, think of that word recovery. What does it mean to recover something? It means to
Yes.
find it.
That's it.
But if
That's
it means to, but what can you find? You can't find something that doesn't exist.
That's right.
You can't find something that was damaged or destroyed. So that, and when you ask people when they recovered, what did you recover? What did you find again? You know what they most often tell me?
Myself.
I found myself. I found myself. And that, so that the essence of trauma was that disconnection from the self. The healing is that reconnection. And that's available to everybody. It really is. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's available.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. In my work, that's the way we kind of frame addiction. We call it the disease of the dis-ease. So there's this between dis and ease. Specifically, it's this dis-ease of the lost self. I've lost myself. Right. And I keep looking outside of myself for something that can only be found on the inside. It can't be found. No, there's no amount of substance. There's no person. There's no, it can't be found from the outside. It's this dis-ease of the lost self. And I love that. I really love that.
You know what the best, you know what the best compliment I ever had, for this book, The Myth of Normal, this young man said to me, I read your book and I remembered myself.
Perfect.
And that's the best review I've ever had.
Yeah.
I remembered, and so again, that reconnection is available as long as there's consciousness. And unfortunately, treatment programs, well-meant and necessary as they are, they don't get that part of it. It's all about, mostly about the behavior, and healing from a disease rather than the person reconnecting. So I think that's, if we just add that piece, the addiction healing paradigm, the piece of trauma and the piece of reconnection with the self, now some people experience that without expressly ever talking about it in those terms. But I think in my experience, we could go so much further helping people with addictions if we help them understand that, no, look, you're not abnormal. That your addiction was in fact a normal response to abnormal circumstances. And I'm telling you, maybe you've seen this too. A lot of people have told me with severe addictions, if it wasn't for the addiction, I would have killed myself.
Yes.
So the addiction did have a, odd to say, but it did have a kind of a survival function for a lot of people.
Yep. I love it. I love approaching this healing work from the perspective of all of us are already whole and complete. We're already whole and complete. That we've just all had all this conditioning and programming and shit, right? Dumped on top of our wholeness, right? Yes. And I love the framework of it, that this means the job is subtraction, right? It's this whole idea of removing all all the conditioning and the programming and the habits and patterns and all those kinds of things that have been dumped on top of the wholeness that we are. You brought that up, that the word heal, right? That from its origin really is holing. We're becoming whole.
That's
once
right.
Again. Yeah.
The wonderful Black American psychologist, Dr. Ken Hardy, talks about what he calls the assaulted sense of self.
Yes.
And the assaulted sense of self is when, in this case, a racialized minority takes on the view of themselves of the oppressor.
Yes.
So in the book, I quote Malcolm X, where he's, at some point, when you read his biography that he wrote with Arthur, what was his name?
I don't know. It's on the tip of my tongue.
Yeah. Anyway.
Also the guy that did Roots.
That's right. Same guy, Haley, but I forget his name. Alex Haley? Alex. Malcolm X is describing how, as a young man, he's standing in front of a mirror, trying to conk his hair, trying to straighten his hair and lighten the color of it, you know. And then at some point later on, when he comes to consciousness, he says to a group of his followers, "Who taught you to hate your color? Who
Yeah.
taught you that your lips are too big and your nose is the wrong shape?" He says, "Now, as a Jew in Eastern Europe, I took on the same assaulted sense of self, you
Yeah.
know, and that I became ashamed of who I was, you know, because of all the anti-Semitism in that part of the world. Now, so this happens on a racialized basis, but it also happens on an individual basis, so that
Absolutely.
so that children who are abused or sexually violated or hit or neglected, or the parents are unavailable because they're too stressed, there's violence in the family, a parent being jailed or a parent dying, a parent being addicted, the child takes on the burden that there's something wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
So that child is an assaulted sense of self,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and then disconnected from what you call the true self, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so anybody who and addictions and mental health conditions are all attempts to escape from the pain of that assaulted sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they are.
And I love as well in the book that this is not about parental blaming or
No,
shaming,
no.
or as a matter of fact, is pretty as far away from that as we can imagine, right? This is cultural conditioning, right? When we're in a culture for example, for the same job, a woman is paid less than
Yeah,
a
yeah,
man, right? You can't help but get culture is telling you you're less than, right? Because in a culture that values money, the way that we elevate money, you're being told you're less than, right? They're being conditioned into being less than, right?
well, and if you actually look at the health situation of women,
Yeah,
women have 80 or 90, 70 or 80% of autoimmune disease,
yeah,
and they're much more likely to have PTSD and mental health conditions, anxiety, depression, and so much more likely to be medicated. Now, not only is that overt discrimination when it comes to power and remuneration, but then women also have the emotional burden of carrying the stress, absorbing the stress and of their men and of their families. So there's a double whammy. Not only do women have to go out there and work to support their families and get paid less for it, but also they have to carry the burden of being the emotional shock absorbers of their families. And that's why women have heavier burden of what we call mental illness and physical illness as well, chronic conditions, you know.
yeah,
So we have to name it. This is
yeah.
a patriarchal society, you know. And when I say patriarchal, I don't mean that individual men deliberately set out
Right. Yeah.
to do that. Is that both men and women are programmed in a certain way of looking at gender relationships in which the woman is not only subordinate, but has to absorb the stress of the entire system.
That's right. I love it. And we can't heal what we don't acknowledge. We
That's right.
cannot heal what we do not acknowledge. Right. And that's part of this, acknowledging this so that it can be healed.
Well, you
Right.
know, it was James Baldwin who said that not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it's not faced.
It's not based. I
Yeah,
love that quote. Love
yeah,
that quote. Right.
yeah,
And I want to go back for a moment I pulled this out of the book to
yeah.
your definition of the definition you use relative to addiction. And particularly for this audience, I want to point out a couple of things. The first sentence is, addiction is a complex psychological, emotional, physiological, neurobiological, social, and spiritual process. Right. And in this whole domain of yoga that we talk about, how the ancients talked about, we have 5 bodies or
Yeah.
layers,
Yeah.
And they're
Yeah.
exactly the ones that you're speaking. If we were to transpose that on that model that the
Yeah.
ancients gave us, they're exactly what you've spoken to here. The
Well,
psychological, emotional, physiological, neurobiological, the spiritual, right? Pieces of those. And then it goes on to say it manifests through any behavior in which a person finds temporary relief or pleasure and therefore craves. But that in the long term causes them or others negative consequences. Yet the person refuses or is unable to give up. And then you say, accordingly, the three main hallmarks of addiction are short-term relief or pleasure and therefore craving, long-term suffering for oneself or others, and the inability to stop. And what I want to point out, the way that you say it in there, that makes a pretty big tent, right?
yeah. Yeah.
In some aspects, I want to ask who's not, right? Right? At some way, shape, or form. One of my teachers always says, like we're pretty much in some level all addicted to the way we process our reality, right? And I love thinking, because for me, this is a piece that can begin to work at taking the stigma out. It
Sure.
can't, this is a condition of humanity. Yeah.
And as you rightly say, a lot of these teachings are not new. They're ancient wisdom. And we have to, as much as we should value the achievements of modern science and research, technology, although of course they've also done a lot of harm, but they're certainly potentially of amazing benefit to humankind.
Yes.
In our arrogance, in our Western arrogance, we've forgotten the wisdom that people have always embraced. And so that, for example, the indigenous people in North America have this concept of the medicine wheel.
Yes.
And the medicine wheel's got these four quadrants. There's the physical, the mental, which contains the emotional and intellectual, the social, our connections with others, and also with nature, and the spiritual, and it's totally true. And if you ignore any one of those quadrants, you're going to have an imbalance.
Yes.
And this society focuses purely on the material, purely on the material. It ignores the social, it ignores the spiritual, and to a large degree, it ignores the emotional as well. And no wonder our treatment programs are so poor. Now, as far as our worldview and how we process the world, the Buddha said 2,500 years ago that everything is the mind in the lead. In other words, how we see the world that defines the world that we live in. What the Buddha didn't say, and this is modern psychology, that before with our mind, we kind of create our world. No, the world creates our minds. And so our early experiences shape how we see the world. You treat, anybody who's ever owned a pet dog can tell you this. If you treat that puppy with love and connection and play with it a lot and so on, it's going to be a very different creature than if you hit it, starve it, and mistreat it and isolate it. That those dogs will have different relationships to the world. They'll see the world in different terms. Well, all the more so human beings. So when human children have their needs met for unconditional loving acceptance, for having their emotions received and validated, for when they have the opportunity to play, where they can rest in a sense of they don't have to work to make the relationship with the parents work, because it's granted freely. Those children will have a very different sense of themselves and of the world than of somebody who grows up in an abusive environment. And there's a very famous person who said that the world is a dog-eat-dog place. Everybody's against you. Even your friends want your house and your wife and your wealth, and these are your friends. This person was the president of the United States, and he grew up in a very abusive household, and that abusive household shaped his view of the world, And then he becomes a politician, and he projects that view of the world onto onto the whole society, which just means that the conditions that shaped him are now projected into the public realm. And we've seen the result. By the way, I'm not just isolating one particular politician here. I think a lot of them are affected that way. And I think a lot of them are very wounded people, and they create a society that reflects their own wounding, unfortunately.
Mhm. Yeah. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. So we just got a little bit more time together, and there are another couple aspects that I would love to get into, particularly for this audience. And we've touched into these, right? This has to do again with cultural narratives, right? And talking about this a little earlier, we live in a culture that uplifts individualism and can get absolutely fixated on data-driven outcomes, right? And the myth of normal suggests, right? And I totally agree that healing addiction is going to require, if we're really about healing, right, that it's going to require a different perspective. And I wondered if you would talk about that a little bit.
Well, let me broaden the conversation to include what we call mental illness in general.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I've first became, well, as a physician, I was always been interested in these questions, but I became personally engaged with them when I myself was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactive disorder in my 50s. And, the symptoms are tuning out, difficulty concentrating, absent-mindedness, poor impulse control, difficulty standing or sitting still. Now, again, this is described as a genetic brain disorder. Despite the fact that I was diagnosed and so were a couple of my kids, I never bought into that because I understood something, that the tuning out and the absent-mindedness are not genetic and they're not a disease. What they are is a coping mechanism. When young children and infants are stressed, which I was in the Second World War, as a Jewish infant under Nazi-occupied Hungary, I had a lot of reasons to be stressed, as you can imagine. I couldn't escape. I couldn't change the situation. I tune out. But when am I tuning out? When my brain is developing, according to that quote from Harvard I just read you. Then the tuning out gets programmed into my brain. Then I create conditions in my life that are stressful. My wife and I have been married 54 years now, but used to have a very stressed marriage when our kids were small. Amidst all that stress, and it doesn't take a world war. We lived in very peaceful Vancouver, but we were both traumatized people. And when people find partners, we always find partners at the same level of trauma that we're at. That's just a given. That means that these two traumatized young people were creating a conflictual home, loving, lots of wonderful stuff, but a lot of conflict, a lot of stress. Our kids are then having to tune out to protect themselves. So what I'm saying is that, or take a mental health condition called depression, a genetic disease. No, it isn't. There's no depression gene, people. Nobody's ever found one, nor will anybody ever find one. When you talk about depression, it just means a pushing down. That's what it means to depress, is to push them. What gets pushed down in depression is emotion, especially healthy anger. Did you ever meet a 2-day-old baby who can push down their anger? No, you haven't. It's a learned behavior. It's a compensation. When the environment cannot receive you, cannot accept you, you will push down aspects of yourself that are unacceptable to the environment in order to be accepted, so that you disconnect from yourself. So what I'm saying is that whether we're talking about addiction, whether we're talking about various mental health conditions, we're talking about disconnection based in childhood stress and trauma. And so that the healing is not just how do we deal with the symptoms. Now, I'm not against medications. I'm a physician. I prescribe them. I've taken them myself. They help me, but they're not the answer. They're not the answer. They deal with symptoms at the very best.
Yeah.
And often they don't even do that, but sometimes they do with dramatic benefit. But they don't solve the problem. The underlying problem is, why am I pushing down on my emotions? And how can I learn to connect myself experience my emotions and express them in a healthy way. That's where the healing comes in.
Yeah.
So whether we're talking about addictions or other mental health challenges, again, we're talking about reconnecting, and that can only happen in a compassionate, safe environment where you're not judged, where you're not controlled,
Yeah.
where somebody can actually see the possibility in you of that reconnection.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, too many treatment programs just focus on the symptoms
Yeah.
or the identified disease rather than the underlying disconnection.
I love what you brought up there. I use this quote a lot, that there'll never be a pharmacological solution to a spiritual problem, right? And that
Exactly.
what we're really speaking to is a problem of spirit.
Yeah.
And thank God for some of these pharmaceuticals and what has happened. But oftentimes what we see is that I know from my work and working with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people over the course of these years, very often we're told, like, you're going to need to be on this for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Or it's used in a way that it's become resolve rather than just relief. And I think we're a culture that confuses or collapses relief and resolve, that we don't know the distinction
I love
between
I love
those things.
I love that formulation, relief or resolve. Look, I myself used to take stimulant medications to help me focus. My first book on ADHD, Scattered Minds, which is
Yep.
published 4 years ago
Yep.
now. And actually, it was published 24 years ago. And this year, it became a New York Times bestseller. So talk about, it's still very
Wow.
relevant. But when I wrote that book, I was on dexedrine to help me focus. I've also was taking antidepressants. Now, I haven't taken antidepressants or stimulant for years. And even when I tried to take, I thought when I started writing The Myth of Normal, maybe I should take the dexedrine again just to help me really focus. All it did is give me side effects, no benefit whatsoever. I've stopped it after 2 days. And this is my most complex work. I did it without medication. So I'm telling you, I'm not just the only example. So yes, medications when necessary, but only when necessary, and especially when it comes to children.
Yeah.
It's such a travesty that the commonest approach to these kids, the commonest approach to these kids is to medicate them rather than to change their environments so they can thrive. Right. And yeah, that's what's necessary. So yeah, medicate when necessary, but only temporarily. And don't think for a minute that medications solve any problems. They may buy you some time. Time for what? Time to do the healing work.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. And then back to that thing about data-driven outcomes and all this kind of stuff. And this was one of the things, again, I really appreciated you pointing out in the book. There's some things that can't be quantified, right? And so, and we are a culture that, and thank God for science and data and all of those things, but we get to a point where that gets lifted to high heaven. And it's the only thing that we begin to look at and not begin to consider the interplay between our biology, our psychology, the social context, right? Then things that can't be reduced to numbers or statistics. Right?
Well, I have two things to say about that. Number one, try and show me love in a test tube. You can't do it. Try and prove love in a laboratory. But what happens but we all know what happens when love is present or when it's not present. So not everything that's dynamic and essential in human life can reduce to data. That's the first point. The second point is more damning, which is that modern medical practice ignores a lot of data. Because the things that I'm talking about in terms of brain development and personality development and the physiology of stress and trauma, tens of thousands of studies published in major scientific journals. The medical profession ignores them. The average physician to this day does not get a single lecture on trauma, which is unbelievable. When trauma is an underlying, documentedly, data proven to be a major contributor to most chronic physical illnesses to mental illnesses. There's a British psychologist, Dr. Richard Bentall, a member of the British Academy, who said that the statistical connection between childhood adversity and adult mental health problems is as strongly established as the link between smoking and lung cancer.
Wow.
But the average physician doesn't get a single lecture on that. And the average psychiatrist is completely, the average, there are exceptions, is completely unaware of that. It's not part of their training. So my problem is not that just we're data driven, it's also that we're very selective in the data that we look at.
Wow. Wow.
And
Wow.
I cite a lot of the data. Look, this book, The Myth of Normal, it's 500 pages. When I first wrote it, it was 1,000 pages long. And why? Because I included all this data, you know, and I was trying to prove everything. Now, there's still a lot of data and references in this
Yes,
book,
there is. Yeah.
but you can certainly find the evidence for everything I've said today in the scientific literature. So my knock on my profession is not that we're evidence-based, but that we're not evidence-based enough. We don't look at evidence that makes us uncomfortable. And trauma
Wow.
makes people very uncomfortable.
Wow. Good point. Good point. All right. Well, I want to end with this question, and I actually pulled a piece of the book out for this. So, one of the things I really love most about this book is that it really does challenge the notion of that there's a quick fix to all these things, right?
Yeah.
And emphasizes that this
Yeah.
is a long-term, long-haul healing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the question becomes, what is going to take for us to really be in this work of creating cultures of prevention and healing so that we don't replicate harm, right? We want to do this in a way that we don't replicate harm. So can you speak to that a little bit?
I can, but are you asking on the social level or on the individual level, or both?
Both.
Okay.
Both.
Well, on the social level, we could begin by looking after the emotional needs of pregnant women. So when I was trained as a physician, I was trained to take the blood pressure and measure the size of the uterus and take the weight and do blood tests and scans. Nobody ever taught me to speak to the woman about the stresses in her life. And yet we know, as I said earlier, that the stresses on the mother can impact the brain physiology of the infant. That's not even controversial.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, how we give birth. Now, in the United States, I don't have to tell you this, just as one example, Black women and babies are dying at much higher numbers than Caucasian.
Yeah.
And partly that has to do with prenatal care, but this is even true in middle-class Black women who get recent medical care because of the embedded and unconscious racism in the system. This is data.
Yeah.
It keeps being published and republished. So we have to really examine our social attitudes in general. Then in British Columbia, where I live, and in many places in the United States, the cesarean section rate is 40%, almost 40%. In some places, it's 50%. That's insane. Cesarean sections can save lives, women and baby. They're essential 10 or 15% of the time. The fact that we've tripled those numbers has to do with our alienation from our bodies and the medical profession's technical, mechanical approach to what is essentially a natural process. And that interferes with the bond between a mother and infant with long-term consequences. That's been shown as well. How we raise children. Human beings evolved in small band hunter-gatherer groups for millions and hundreds of thousands of years. We lived in community where kids were always with the parents. The kids were always held. Kids were not hit, by the way. The kids were not separated, you know, from the parents. And there was a whole community to support the parents.
Yeah.
Well, in this society, there's increasing isolation. Parents are stressed. Parents don't even see their kids most of the day. Of course, you're going to have a lot of kids with increasing number of children with mental health conditions. So how we support pregnant women, how we give birth, how do we support young families to provide the right nurturing environment? how we treat kids in school? Do we treat them as numbers and as widgets to be shaped in a certain way so they can fit into an individualistic, materialistic, competitive, and greedy economic system?
Mhm.
Or do we support their communality, their connection, and their strong sense of self and their emotional health? So this is on a social level, and I could of course go on a lot
Yeah,
more the social
yeah,
circumstances, the rising inequality. In the
yeah.
Time magazine had an article 2 years ago or 3 years ago that in the last few decades, the top 1% has gained $50 trillion at the expense of the rest of us. And it's been shown in multiple studies that the more inequality there is in a society, the more addiction there is, the more ill health there is, physical and mental. So we have to address the large economic issues. Now I could go on and on, but
Yeah.
on the individual level, we have to, those of us that are caregivers, we have to approach our clients with an understanding of their trauma, with real compassion, with no judgment of their behavior, but with curiosity about what's driving that behavior. And to the extent that we ourselves are wounded, we have to deal with our own stuff. And some of the most important work that my students do is not about learning techniques, it's about looking at themselves. Because
Yep.
how the therapist or the physician or the social worker or the counselor shows up energetically affects the sense of safety of the client. And as one of my teachers said, only when compassion is present will people allow themselves to see the truth. So if we want people to be able to see the truth about themselves, we need to treat them with all kinds of compassion and understanding.
I love it. And I want to read this. I think this is the second to the last paragraph in the whole book, right? And for
Okay?
me, it answers this question, right? And it says, it all starts with waking up to what's real and authentic in and around us and what isn't. Waking up to who we are and who we're not. Waking up to what our bodies are expressing and what our minds are suppressing. Waking up to our wounds and our gifts. Waking up to what we have believed and what we actually value. Waking up to what we will no longer tolerate and what we can now accept. Waking up to the myths that bind us and the interconnections that define us. Waking up to the past as it has been, the present as it is, and the future as it may yet be. Waking up most especially to the gap between what our essence calls for and what quote unquote normal has demanded of us. And I read that, Gabor, and I said to myself, I don't know if you identify as a yogi, but that's one of the most yogic things I've ever heard.
Well, I assure you, I'm as far away from a yogi as you can possibly get. Just ask my wife on a bad day, okay? But James Baldwin, this business of being awake, there's this pejorative right now. Woke is a pejorative.
Yeah,
People, I'm asking you, what's the opposite of woke? Asleep?
yeah,
I mean, would you rather be woke or would you rather be asleep? For
yeah.
God's sakes. James Baldwin, again, who's just so poignant and brilliant. He said that
Brilliant.
in this country, words are used more to cover the sleeper than to wake him up,
Yeah.
you know. And in our society, we do so much to put people to sleep with our entertainment and the emphasis on
Distraction.
distractions.
Yeah.
And we all need to wake up because, for God's sakes, I mean, just look at the heat this summer. What is it going to take to wake us up, you know?
That's
And
right.
so I'm all in favor of being woke, not in kind of a limited self-righteous sense, but in the sense of being fully awake. I think
That's it.
that's the first step, is we have to wake up. And that means really looking at things the way they are.
That's it. That's it. Gabor, I can't thank you enough. right? This was perfect and wonderful. And I'm so grateful. I'm just so deeply grateful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I can assure you, you're no more grateful than I am. I love the conversation with you. And thanks for this opportunity for me to share my perspective with your audience. Thank you.
I love it. Thanks so much.
Okay.